The math of the Tiger tank was simple and it was terrifying. One Tiger was worth 4 Shermans. This wasn't a rumor. It was the documented reality of the Western Front in 1944. The German Tiger weighed 56 tons. It carried an 88-millimeter cannon that could punch through a Sherman from over a mile away. The American M4 Sherman weighed 33 tons. Its 75-millimeter gun couldn't even scratch the front of a Tiger at point-blank range. In September 1944, German High Command decided to use this math to kill a legend. They wanted to stop General George S. Patton. They gathered 92 Tiger tanks for a single operation. This was the largest concentration of heavy armor ever sent against American forces. Hitler called it Operation Iron Hammer. The goal was to cut Patton's throat and stall the Third Army before it reached the Rhine. On paper, the Americans should have been annihilated. On paper, Patton's tanks were nothing more than targets, but the Germans had forgotten to account for one man. He wasn't a general. He wasn't a tactical genius from West Point. He was a 23-year-old former auto mechanic from Cleveland. His name was Eddie Kowalski, and he was about to prove that a Tiger isn't a god. It's just a machine with a very long list of flaws. Eddie Kowalski didn't look like the man who would help destroy the German Panzer Corps. Before the war, he rebuilt Chevrolet transmissions in his uncle's garage. He understood engines through sound and vibration. He knew that every machine, no matter how powerful, has a failure mode. In 1943, he was drafted and assigned as a driver for the Third Army. By August 1944, he was in France watching his friends die. Eddie saw a Tiger for the first time near Mortain. He watched a single German tank destroy 3 Shermans in less than 2 minutes. The crews burned alive because they tried to fight the Tiger head-on. That night, Eddie sat in the grass and opened a small, oil-stained notebook. He didn't write about fear. He wrote about specifications. He had noticed that the Tiger's massive turret moved at a crawl. It took 60 seconds for a Tiger to rotate its gun 360 degrees. A Sherman could do the same rotation in just 15 seconds. Eddie wrote down the Tiger's ground pressure. It was so heavy that it sank into soft French soil like an anchor. He noted the engine sound. The Tiger's engine struggled when it shifted gears. He wasn't the only one taking notes. Across the division, drivers and gunners were sharing what they saw. Eddie began talking to other crews, collecting data like a mechanic at a car show. Where was the armor thinnest? The sides and the rear. How fast could it accelerate? It moved like a freight train, slow and ponderous. What happened when it ran out of specialized fuel? It became a 56-ton paperweight. Soon, Eddie's notebook and the notebooks of men like him were filled with practical ways to kill the invincible weapon. He shared these notes with his commander, Lieutenant James Morrison. Morrison didn't dismiss the mechanic. He saw the logic. He took the notebook to Captain Robert Hayes. Hayes took it to the battalion. The battalion took it to Third Army headquarters. General Patton's staff was looking for exactly this kind of raw intelligence. They were tired of West Point doctrine that said the Tiger was a superweapon. They needed the Kowalski protocols. They needed to treat the German army like a broken engine that needed to be dismantled. But while the Americans were reading a mechanic's notes, the Germans were fueled up. 92 Tigers were now idling in the forests of Lorraine. But they were not just a collection of tanks. They were the fist of the 5th Panzer Army, a force designed to crush the American advance. General Hasso von Manteuffel was the man given the task of wielding this iron hammer. He was one of Germany's most brilliant armored commanders, a man who understood the Tiger's power and its peril. Manteuffel knew that the Third Army was moving too fast for its own good. He planned to catch Patton's lead elements, specifically the 4th Armored Division, in a massive steel vise. The orders for Operation Iron Hammer came directly from the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's secret headquarters. The Fuhrer was obsessed with the 88-millimeter gun and the psychological terror it inflicted. He believed that 92 of Germany's finest tanks, including Tigers, Panthers, and Panzer IVs, could achieve what entire infantry divisions had failed to do. The deployment consisted of 2 heavy tank battalions, the 506th and the 503rd. These were elite units, manned by veterans who had survived the slaughter of the Eastern Front. They were not the average conscripts that Patton had been steamrolling across France. Each Tiger crew was a 5-man team of specialists: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator. The Germans organized the 92 tanks into 3 distinct defensive belts across the Lorraine Plateau. The first belt was designed to lure the Americans into a long-range killing zone. Manteuffel positioned his forward Tigers on the reverse slopes of ridges. This is a tactic called hull-down, where only the thickest part of the turret is visible to the enemy. From these positions, the German gunners could use their T2F 9B telescopic sights to pick off Shermans. The Zeiss optics were the best in the world, allowing a Tiger to hit a moving target at 2,000 meters. At that range, the Americans couldn't even see the muzzle flash of the German guns. The second belt of Tigers was positioned in the villages and narrow valley passes. These were the gatekeepers meant to destroy any units that survived the first ridge line. The third belt was the mobile reserve. 30 Tigers held back to counterattack any American breakthrough. But beneath the fearsome surface of the 92 Tigers, the mechanic's nightmare was already beginning. Moving 92 tanks that weigh 56 tons each is a logistical catastrophe. The Tiger's Maybach HL-230 P-45 engine was a masterpiece of engineering, but it was fragile. It generated 700 horsepower, but it consumed fuel at a staggering rate of 300 liters per 100 kilometers. France's infrastructure was not built for this kind of weight. Bridges that could hold a 33-ton Sherman would buckle and collapse under a 56-ton Tiger. The German engineers had to scout every single creek and overpass before the tanks could move. If a Tiger broke a final drive gear, there were no spare parts in the local supply depots. Every replacement part had to be shipped by rail from factories in Kassel, Germany. Patton's air superiority made the German rail lines a death trap for these heavy shipments. The German crews spent their nights hand-cranking the massive turrets because the electrical motors were failing. They were forced to use slave cables to start the engines in the damp morning air. Despite these flaws, the German morale remained high because they trusted the 88mm gun. They believed the American Sherman was a Ronson-lighter, a nickname given because it lit up on the first strike. The German gunners practiced their range-finding, waiting for the first sound of American treads. The geography of the Lorraine region favored the defender. The rolling hills and deep forests provided perfect concealment for a 56-ton ambush predator. Manteuffel ordered his crews to maintain total radio silence. They didn't want the Allied ultra-code breakers to detect the location of the 92 Tigers. They sat in the morning mist, the crews eating cold rations inside the cramped steel hulls. They could hear the distant rumble of Patton's Third Army moving toward them from the west. The Americans were coming in 2 massive columns, unaware of the steel wall ahead. The German plan was to wait until the lead Shermans were within 1,000 meters. Then, all 92 Tigers would open fire simultaneously in a coordinated steel salvo. This would decapitate the American leadership and leave the remaining tanks in a state of panic. But Eddie Kowalski's notebook was already circulating through the 4th Armored. The Americans weren't coming as a neat, disciplined column of targets. They were coming in with a new set of rules that prioritized speed over safety. The iron hammer was raised, but the American anvil was about to move in a way the Germans didn't anticipate. The battle was about to begin in the valley of Arracourt. It would be the most violent armor-on-armor engagement of the entire fall campaign. The 92 Tigers were ready to stop Patton, but they were about to meet a mechanic who knew their secrets. The morning fog was about to lift, and the first Sherman was cresting the ridge. The steel salvo was only seconds away. The German gunners gripped their hand wheels, ready to unleash the 88mm math of annihilation. But the anvil was about to move, and the man holding the hammer was about to be outmaneuvered. General George S. Patton received the intelligence reports about the German armor concentration at 0400. Most commanders in his position would have ordered a tactical halt to wait for infantry support. Standard doctrine dictated that you do not attack 92 Tiger tanks with a force of medium Shermans in open terrain. But Patton understood that in armored warfare, the defender has the advantage only as long as they control the distance. He knew that the Tiger was a sniper, and the best way to beat a sniper is to turn the duel into a knife fight. Patton's paradox was simple. The more dangerous the enemy, the faster you must move toward them. He ordered the 4th Armored Division to accelerate their advance immediately. He didn't want the Tigers to have time to finish their morning maintenance or refine their range cards. Patton's staff officers initially thought the order was a suicide mission for the lead tanks. They argued that charging into the 88mm kill zones would result in 100% casualties for the vanguard. Patton's response was characteristically blunt and focused on the mechanical reality of the German tanks. He told his officers that a tiger sitting still is a fortress, but a tiger trying to turn is a target. He ordered his columns to split into 3 separate prongs of attack. This forced the 92 Tigers to divide their attention and their slow-traversing turrets. The American tanks were ordered to bypass the main German strongpoints and head for the rear areas. Patton wanted to destroy the German fuel trucks and the maintenance depots that kept the Tigers alive. Eddie Kowalski sat in the driver's seat of his Sherman, checking his oil pressure gauges. He could hear the radio traffic from the scout units who were already under fire. The lieutenant told the crew that they were not going to play by the German rules today. They weren't going to sit at 2,000 meters and wait for a shell to find them. The order from the 4th Armored was maximum speed and minimum distance. Every Sherman crew was told to close the gap to under 500 meters as quickly as possible. At 500 meters, the American 75mm gun actually stood a chance of penetrating the Tiger's side armor. Eddie knew that this required pushing the Sherman's Ford GAA V8 engine to its absolute limit. The Sherman was a 33-ton machine designed for agility and mechanical reliability. Its vertical volute spring suspension allowed it to maintain speed over rough French fields. Eddie adjusted his seat, feeling the vibration of the engine through his spine. He knew the Tiger drivers were struggling with their complex, interlocking Schock Telemark road wheels. These wheels were a nightmare in the mud, as the inner wheels would frequently clog with debris. If an inner wheel failed, the German crew had to remove 5 outer wheels just to reach it. Eddie realized that while the Tigers were formidable, they were also fragile and overworked. The Americans were counting on the fact that the German machines would fail under the stress of a high-tempo battle. Patton also ordered his 105mm artillery batteries to move within 3 miles of the front line. This was dangerously close for heavy guns, but it allowed for immediate fire support. He didn't want his crews waiting for 15 minutes for a fire mission to be approved. He wanted shells falling on the Tigers within 60 seconds of a contact report. The Americans also deployed M18 Hellcat tank destroyers on the extreme flanks. These vehicles were essentially a massive 76mm gun mounted on a high-speed chassis. They could reach speeds of 55 miles per hour, making them nearly impossible for a Tiger turret to track. The Hellcats were the wolves that would circle the German bears while the Shermans charged the front. As the sun began to rise on September 19, 1944, the American columns began their sprint. The crews didn't use the roads. They drove straight through the orchards and the farm fields. They created a massive cloud of dust and smoke that obscured the German optics. The German gunners at Arracourt were expecting a slow, methodical approach. Instead, they saw dozens of American silhouettes appearing from multiple directions simultaneously. The German commanders were forced to constantly adjust their turret positions. The hydraulic systems in the Tigers were straining under the rapid movement. Some Tigers actually broke their turret traverse gears before they fired the first shot. Eddie Kowalski gripped the steering levers as his Sherman crested the first ridge. He could see the silhouettes of the Tigers in the distance, their long gun barrels searching for targets. He knew that the next 10 minutes would decide whether the 92 Tigers would win the day. The Patton paradox was in full effect. The safest place was right in the middle of the danger zone. The first American shell screamed through the air, and the valley erupted into a chaos of steel and fire. But as the range closed, a new factor entered the battlefield that the Germans had not predicted. A thick, white wall of fog began to roll in front of the Moselle River. It was about to change the math of the 88mm gun forever. The morning of September 19, 1944, brought a weather phenomenon that would decide the fate of the 5th Panzer Army. A heavy, blinding fog settled over the Arracourt Valley, reducing visibility to less than 200 yards. This was a catastrophic development for General von Manteuffel and his 92 Tiger tanks. The Tiger was designed for long-range dominance, utilizing its superior Zeiss optics to kill targets at 2 kilometers. In this thick soup, those optics were rendered completely useless. The German gunners could no longer see the American columns until they were almost on top of them. The steel salvo that was supposed to occur at extreme range was now impossible. General Patton's 4th Armored Division did not slow down. They used the fog as a tactical shield. They relied on their SCR-508 radio sets to maintain contact between their tanks. The Germans, however, maintained strict radio silence to avoid detection, leaving individual Tiger commanders isolated in the mist. Without a clear picture of the battlefield, the 92 Tigers became 92 separate, blind fortresses. Eddie Kowalski kept his eyes glued to the narrow vision slot in the front of his Sherman. He could see the dark, square silhouettes of the Tigers appearing and disappearing through the white haze. He knew that at this range, the Tiger's biggest weakness was about to be exploited: the turret traverse rate. The Tiger's turret was powered by a hydraulic system that was linked to the main engine's RPM. To turn the turret quickly, the driver had to rev the engine, which made the tank a loud and visible target. Even at maximum power, the turret turned at only 6 degrees per second. Eddie Sherman utilized an independent electric hydraulic system that allowed for much faster rotation. His commander, Lieutenant Morrison, spotted a Tiger emerging from the fog just 150 yards to their right. The Tiger's long 88mm gun was pointed forward, away from the American position. The German commander was frantically trying to rotate his turret to face the new threat. Eddie felt his heart racing as he watched the slow, mechanical grind of the massive German gun. Morrison didn't wait for the German turret to align. He gave the order to fire the 75mm main gun. The Sherman stabilizer system allowed them to fire accurately even while moving at a slow crawl. The first American round struck the Tiger's side armor just above the tracks. This area was protected by only 80mm of steel, which was vulnerable at such close proximity. The shell didn't penetrate the main hull, but it jammed the Tiger's turret ring. The German tank was now incapable of returning fire with its primary weapon. Eddie pushed the throttle forward, circling the crippled giant to stay behind its rear armor. This was the mechanic's maneuver he had described in his notebook. He knew that the Tiger's rear plate was only 82mm thick. The second American shot hit the Tiger's engine deck, rupturing the fuel lines and the cooling system. Thick black smoke began to pour out of the German tank as the crew abandoned the vehicle. The scene was being repeated across the Arracourt Valley as the fog continued to hold. The 4th Armored Division was using its superior mobility to outturn the heavier German armor. The German crews were trained for stand-and-fight tactics, but the Americans were playing hit-and-run. The 92 Tigers were being picked apart in small, violent skirmishes that the Germans couldn't coordinate. Manteuffel tried to order a local counterattack, but the radio interference in the fog made it impossible. The American 105mm artillery also began firing white phosphorus rounds into the valley. These shells created even more smoke and heat, further blinding the German infrared sensors. The Tigers were now operating in a world of total sensory deprivation. Every time a Tiger fired its 88mm gun, the massive muzzle flash gave away its exact position. The American Hellcat tank destroyers were now moving through the fog at 40 miles per hour. They used their speed to dash between the German tanks, firing at the thin rear armor and then vanishing. The 92 Tigers were no longer an iron hammer. They were a group of blind giants being stung by a swarm of wasps. By 0900, the first German defensive belt had completely collapsed. The American vanguard had bypassed the ridge lines and was now moving into the second belt. The fog began to thin slightly, but the psychological damage to the German crews was already done. They had lost the initiative, and they were beginning to realize that the Sherman was a much more dangerous opponent than their propaganda suggested. Eddie Kowalski looked out at the burning wreckage of the first Tiger they had killed. He knew that the 506th and the 503rd Battalions were not going to give up easily. They still had over 70 operational tanks, and they were now pulling back to the villages for cover. The battle was moving into its second, more dangerous phase, the urban ambush. The Americans entered the outskirts of Juvisy at 10:15 a.m. The fog was lifting, replaced by a cold, gray drizzle that slicked the cobblestone streets. Manteuffel had ordered his remaining 72 Tigers to abandon the open fields and move into the stone-walled villages. He wanted to negate the American speed and turn the town into a vertical killing ground. A Tiger hidden inside a barn or behind a stone church was a nightmare for a Sherman. The 88mm gun could fire down a narrow alley and destroy an entire column of tanks in seconds. Eddie Kowalski shifted his Sherman into second gear, moving at a walking pace. He followed the infantry of the 10th Armored Infantry Battalion, who were clearing the houses room by room. The American infantry used M1 Garand rifles and BARs to suppress German snipers. But the real threat was the Panzerfaust, a disposable anti-tank weapon that could pierce 200 millimeters of armor. Every window and every cellar was a potential launch site for a shape-charged grenade. The Sherman crews were ordered to keep their hatches buttoned up to avoid sniper fire and grenades. Eddie's notebook had a specific section on urban ambush detection. He had noted that the heavy weight of a Tiger would crack the pavement and leave deep ruts in the dirt. He scanned the ground, looking for the telltale signs of the wide 725mm Ostketten tracks. He saw a series of fresh, deep gouges leading into a massive stone warehouse near the village square. Eddie signaled to Lieutenant Morrison, who radioed the position to the nearby M18 Hellcats. The Americans didn't want to drive past the warehouse and expose their thin-side armor to a point-blank shot. Instead of charging the building, the Americans utilized a combined arms trap. The infantry moved to the rooftops surrounding the warehouse carrying white phosphorus grenades. Simultaneously, a 105mm artillery battery pre-registered their fire on the building's coordinates. The goal was to smoke out the Tiger and force it into the street where the Hellcats were waiting. The infantry threw their grenades through the upper windows of the warehouse, creating a blinding, choking cloud of chemical smoke. Inside the building, the German crew panicked as the white phosphorus began to burn their skin. The Tiger's engine roared as the driver threw the 56-ton machine into reverse. It smashed through the rear wall of the warehouse, sending a shower of stone and timber onto the street. The German commander was blinded by the smoke and couldn't see the M18 Hellcat positioned 300 yards down the road. The Hellcat's 76mm gun was already loaded with HVAP, or high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition. This round utilized a tungsten core that could penetrate 150 millimeters of steel at close range. The American gunner fired twice in rapid succession, hitting the Tiger's side armor. The first round shattered the Tiger's drive sprocket, immobilizing the tank instantly. The second round penetrated the fuel tank, causing a massive internal explosion that blew the turret off the hull. This was the village trap in action, using infantry to find the target and specialized armor to kill it. Across Juvalise, the Americans were using the same methodology to dismantle the German defense. They used M3 half-tracks to move infantry quickly between the stone houses flanking the German positions. The 92 Tigers were now losing their cohesion as individual crews tried to escape the burning village. Manteuffel was losing his grip on the battle, as his iron hammer was being chipped away piece by piece. The German logistics were also failing, as the fuel trucks were being destroyed by P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers. A Tiger without fuel was nothing more than a very expensive stationary target. By 1 p.m., the Americans had cleared the center of the village and were pushing toward the eastern exit. They had destroyed 14 more Tigers in the narrow streets, while losing only 3 Shermans and 2 half-tracks. The ratio was now heavily in favor of the 4th Armored Division. Eddie Kowalski felt a sense of grim satisfaction as he drove past the burning German tanks. He knew that the invincible myth of the Tiger was dying in the mud of Lorraine, but the German 5th Panzer Army still had its third belt of 30 Tigers in reserve. They were now preparing for a final, desperate counterattack on the American flank. The battle was moving from the villages back into the open plains. The Americans were about to face the last and most dangerous element of Operation Iron Hammer. The Manteuffel meltdown was about to reach its boiling point. The German commander realized that his defensive belts had failed to contain the American momentum. He had lost over 40% of his heavy armor in less than 6 hours. Manteuffel decided to commit his final 30 Tigers from the mobile reserve for a massed counterstroke. The final 30 Tigers of the 506th Heavy Panzer Battalion emerged from the woods east of Juvisy at 2:30 p.m. This was the largest single group of heavy armor left in the sector. Manteuffel ordered them to charge the American flank in a Keil or wedge formation. This formation was designed to concentrate the 88 mm fire on a narrow front. It was the same tactic that had broken the Soviet lines at Kursk in 1943. The German crews were ordered to ignore the American infantry and focus entirely on the 4th Armored Shermans. They needed to create a Panzerschreck, or tank terror, to force a retreat. Eddie Kowalski saw the massive cloud of dust rising from the tree line. He checked his ammunition rack, noting they only had 8 rounds of M61 APC-BC left. The lieutenant ordered the company to form a defensive echelon right. They needed to present as small a target as possible to the approaching steel wedge. The range was closing fast, down to 1,200 yards. This was the Tiger's ideal killing distance. The 88 mm shells began to scream over the field, hitting the ground with a force that felt like an earthquake. One shell struck a nearby Sherman's frontal plate, shearing off the drive sprocket and sending the tank into a violent spin. But the American artillery was already responding with a time-on-target barrage. This technique involved timing the shells from multiple batteries to land at the exact same second. The 105 mm shells rained down on the German wedge, hitting the thin top armor of the Tigers. The explosions didn't destroy the Tigers, but they shattered the periscopes and the external optics. The German commanders were forced to button up their hatches, losing their situational awareness. Simultaneous P-47 Thunderbolts dived from the clouds, firing 5-inch HVAR rockets. The rockets were notoriously inaccurate, but the psychological impact was devastating. The German wedge began to break apart as individual Tiger drivers swerved to avoid the air-to-ground fire. The Tigers were now separated, making them vulnerable to the Kowalski protocols. Eddie pushed his Sherman forward, closing the distance to 600 yards. He saw a Tiger that had been dazed by a rocket strike. Its turret was traversing wildly, unable to find a target. The American gunner fired twice into the Tiger's running gear. The shells hit the complex road wheels, jamming the tracks. The 56-ton giant was now a stationary target in the middle of a killing field. As the sun began to set, the German counterattack stalled completely. The iron hammer had been shattered against an American anvil of coordinated steel, air, and artillery. The 92 Tigers were now a memory of burning scrap. By the morning of September 20th, 1944, the rolling fields around Arracourt had become a graveyard for the 5th Panzer Army. Out of the 92 German tanks, the Tigers, Panthers, and Panzer IVs that Manteuffel had sent to stop Patton, the final tally was staggering. By the time the fighting ended, less than a dozen Tigers remained capable of fighting. The rest were smoldering ruins, abandoned due to empty fuel tanks or disabled by mechanical failure. In total, over 200 German armored vehicles had been destroyed or abandoned during the Lorraine campaign. The German survivors were in a state of absolute shock. They had entered the valley with the most powerful armored weapon of the century. They had been systematically dismantled by a medium tank they mocked as a Ronson. But the Sherman hadn't won because its steel was thicker. It had won because it was a better managed machine supported by a superior industrial system. Eddie Kowalski and his crew survived the 3-day engagement without a single scratch on their paint. His oil-stained notebook was no longer just a collection of grease monkey observations. Along with the notes of countless other drivers and gunners, it helped shape the tactics of the entire 4th Armored Division. The Cleveland mechanic had successfully deconstructed the myth of the invincible German superweapon. He proved that even a 56-ton giant can be bled if you know exactly where the skin is thinnest. The Kowalski protocols were eventually formalized by Third Army intelligence officers. These protocols emphasized targeting the Schachtellevark road wheels to immobilize the heavy hulls. They taught crews to exploit the Tiger's slow turret traverse by using high-speed circle strafing maneuvers. This doctrine saved thousands of American lives during the final race toward the Rhine. Eddie was eventually promoted to sergeant for his technical contributions to the war effort. After the war ended, Eddie returned home to Cleveland, Ohio. He didn't talk much about the Tigers, Patton, or the medals he had earned. He went back to his uncle's garage and continued fixing transmissions for the neighbors. He knew that the war wasn't won by a single miracle weapon or a secret plan. It was won by the men who understood the mechanical limits of their machines and refused to be intimidated. The 92 Tigers had been Hitler's final hope for a strategic stalemate in the West. Their total destruction cleared the path for the Allied breakout across mainland France. The Tiger was an engineering marvel, but it was a logistical and operational failure. It was too heavy for French bridges and too complex for the mud of Lorraine. The American Sherman was the opposite: simple, reliable, and agile. It was the hammer that actually stayed in one piece. Arracourt remains the greatest tactical defeat for heavy armor in military history. It proved that in the industrial age, volume and coordination will always defeat singular, over-engineered power. Eddie Kowalski's legacy lives on in every modern armored manual today. The lesson is simple. Never underestimate the man with the wrench. He sees the cracks that the generals ignore. And in the heat of battle, those cracks are where history is truly made. If you enjoyed this look at the death of the Tiger myth, hit the like button. Subscribe for more stories of mechanical grit. Thank you for watching.